All right, welcome everyone to the CMMC proposed rule brief. Just some quick housekeeping. I know that a lot of people have questions. You might have more questions after we review the brief. If you have a question, please do put it in the Q&A section in Zoom. It should be along the bottom of your screen to be able to pull that up, and we'll try to answer that live. Um, I don't know if we'll get an overwhelming amount of questions, and maybe we need to send up a follow-up email where we run out of time, and then be able to answer everybody's questions that way for the good of the order. Either way, we'll make sure that we get all the questions that everybody has answered in one way or another. So let's get started. So the first thing to make sure everyone understands is that understanding the CMMC rule is your responsibility. Doesn't matter who you are, if you're going to be in the ecosystem, understanding the rule is absolutely your responsibility. And remember, this session is a brief. The reason why we're doing a brief is because the document is hundreds of pages long, almost 200 pages long. So this consolidates some of the highlights and some of the most important information for you to be able to know. So consider this more of a starter session to assure that you are on the right track and to help you make sure that you're going to be ready when the rule goes final in the fall. So for those of you that are new to the call, who haven't hopped on one of my webinars before, I'm Leia Shilobod. I'm the founder of Compliance CIT. I'm a member of the CMMC Industry Standards Council, as well as the MSPs for the Support of Critical Infrastructure. Those are two organizations that have stakeholders in them from the CMMC ecosystem. Both organizations do have influence with both the Cyber AB and DoD. So we're communicating with them about our concerns as well as some clarification that's required. Some of the information that I'm presenting to you today is from work that we've been doing in those two organizations. CIT is also a CMMC RPO, Registered Practitioner Organization. I'm a CMMC professional, and I'm also a Certified Information Security Manager. So let's start with an overall assessment of the rule as it was published last month. The revised rule itself was well written overall, and it did provide good clarity on the program. However, additional clarity really needs to be delivered to all of us to understand how this looks functionally. So you can read it and you can say, okay, I kind of get it, but then you think about implementation and what this actually looks like in the real world, and that's where you start to have a lot of questions. And some of those questions we're going to raise later in the brief. So let's move on to the proposed rule highlights and implications. First, we have a new term. There's an existing term that many of us are already familiar with, organization seeking compliance. So typically we talk about OSCs as a contractor who is looking for a CMMC level 2 or level 3 assessment. But they did recognize that they were leaving out some other organizations, and they had to more standardize and clarify the process for organizations that don't need certification. So they came up with a new term, Organization Seeking Assessment, or OSA. OSAs are companies who require a level 1 controls, and contractors who only require a level 2 self-assessment. Level 1s will be a pass-fail, those 15 controls that they have to implement. They'll log into SPRS and new functionality will open up for you if you only need a level 1 controls to enter a pass-fail, like you've implemented everything or you haven't, into the SPRS portal. Level 2 OSAs will enter their attestation that they've implemented all 110 controls and that 110 score into SPRS. What's important to note here is even though there is bifurcation at level 2, with some organizations requiring only a self-assessment and attestation, some of them will require certification. Most contracts, including CUI, are going to require certification and not attestation. We don't know at this time exactly how that's going to work. We do know that that will come from DoD. The clarity will be from DoD. Really quickly, some clarification on bidding on contracts and contract award. Certification is not required to bid on contracts, though from working with lots of dozens of contractors throughout the ecosystem, they report that it does help in winning contracts and being considered for contract if you are talking to them about either pursuing certification or organizations that already had a joint surveillance assessment. Certification, though, is required at contract award. So to bid, you don't have to have the certification yet, but if there's a certification requirement, you cannot be awarded the contract until you have passed that certification and are able to submit that information. So your action here is to set a date that you're going to be completely prepared for assessment based on your contract cycle. Put that date out there and let your entire team and anyone else that you're working with know that this is our drop dead date. This is what we are racing fast towards to give yourself a deadline. Quickly, let's talk about what assessment means. So assessment, as far as this entire program is concerned, means testing or evaluation of the security controls to determine the extent to which the controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired result and outcome with respect to meeting that security requirement. So this is actually something that with the organizations that we work with, when we do the security assessment control section, so you need to do a security assessment at least yearly. It says periodically, so that means it has to happen at least yearly. And we follow that same kind of methodology, breaking up the controls over the cycle of quarters, so that we can do that deep dive in the assessment of the satisfactory implementation of the controls and assure that they're operating as they're intended. That's actually a really good tip for you if you're not doing it right now. There was also good clarification on ESPs and CSPs. So ESP is any external services provider. They gave us clarity on what that means. It's any external people, technology, or facility that processes, transmits, or stores CUI, or that holds security protection data. And they give an example of log or configuration data, and a note here that it's example, which means that there could be a wider definition of security protection data besides log or configuration data. And that that information must be processed, stored, or transmitted to the ESP assets in order to be considered an ESP. So any organization that's external to you that is processing, transmitting, or storing your CUI, or any organization external to you that is storing, processing, or transmitting security protection data. And then they clarified for us a little bit more what cloud service provider means. That's going to be an external company that provides a platform, infrastructure, applications, or storage services for its clients, and it's defined by CISA, so you can actually go to this document and get clarity on, is this provider that we're using considered a cloud services provider? So essentially what this means is um, that a CSP is considered an ESP, but a special kind of ESP with special requirements. What are those requirements? The cloud services provider must be FedRAMP authorized and hold an ATO, or based on the DoD memo that came out last month, they had to have implemented the FedRAMP moderate baselines and have a letter of attestation from a 3PAO. The 3PAOs are the international assessor organizations. They are not part of the CMMC ecosystem. The reason why they opened it up to allow FedRAMP moderate baselines for CSPs to be able to store, process, or transmit CUI is because it's very difficult to get a FedRAMP ATO. In order to get that authorization to operate, you actually have to have a government contract and be engaged with the government. And they recognize that that would really severely limit the ability for people to be able to use cloud services. So that was the intent of the memo that came out last month. And your action right now is to vet your CSPs to assure that they meet those requirements or are on an action plan to meet these requirements. So if you already are working with the CSP and they already are FedRAMP authorized, then you're good. If you're working with a CSP, like you're storing data in a third party cloud-based program that either you're working on to collaborate or maybe to send information back and forth, you're going to want to contact them and assure that that they are either implementing or have already implemented the FedRAMP moderate baselines and that they've read that memo from the DoD. Now let's talk about ESP requirements. So we're talking about ESPs who are not CSPs, right? So these external services providers um, include MSPs, MSSPs, or any other security tool set that will have access to configuration data or log data. So maybe if you have a SIM or an MDR product, they would fall into that category of ESP. They also need to implement the CMMC level of their clients. That means that if a contractor requires a level 2 certification, their MSSP or MSP must also attain that same certification level. So what your action is to vet your MSPs and MSSPs to assure that they are on an action plan to implement the controls and intend on certifying. There are many MSPs and MSSPs that have entered the market and have seen this as an opportunity to be able to grow their business. However, many of them also don't understand the lift that's going to be required in order to continue to do that business. So you want to be really clear with them about what the requirements are and get them to somehow verify for you that that they currently are working on this and that they have an action plan in order to get certified. More requirements. Here are some implications about these ESP requirements. So it's important to try to figure out right now, vetting those vendors, figuring out who you need to replace, whether it's going to be a tool set or it's going to be an organization who's providing security services or IT support for you. Now is important to do so you have time to transition if it is necessary. Here's another implication. There's over 100,000 contractors who need to be certified, and the ecosystem is already going to be overwhelmed with those assessments, with the people who actually have the CUI. And here's another question. Can you pass a level 2 certification if your ESP, like your MSP or your MSSP, is not certified yet? Does that mean they're going to prioritize ESPs for certification over the contractors who actually hold this information? And how is that going to affect the rollout for the CMMC requirement for contractors? Here's another question we're asking. Will the certification of your MSP or MSSP be inherited on some of the controls, making your certification as an OSC easier and less expensive? We kind of hope that that's the case because that makes a lot of sense. And there's even the question of how an MSP or MSSP should properly and satisfactorily apply the controls in their own company because we don't process, store, or transmit CUI. Uh, so that begs the question, will there be more controls or different requirements for protecting security protection data? And will our certification process as an MSP or MSSP look a little different than a typical OSC? And the thing is, guys, I'm talking to a lot of people about this, and the groups that I'm engaged with and the thought leaders in the ecosystem, none of them agree on the answers to these questions. So because of this, if you're on this call and you're having the same kind of questions in your head about what is this going to look like in real life, functionally, consider submitting some public comments to DoD so we can get clarity. Regardless, though, we know it's coming and there is no excuse for everyone to not be taking action now. This is not a wait and see time. It's coming. It's also really clear from the rule that we're going to have lots of pressure on primes. DoD is clear that the onus of assuring that FCI and CUI data is secure is on the primes. So we see them creating, and some of them haven't done this yet, some of them have created their own systems of assuring contractor compliance at every level of the supply chain. So what should you expect? Expect more pressure and more requirements from primes and be prepared to respond. Just, I think it was yesterday, one of our clients, right before a call that we were going to talk about CMMC, received an email from their prime contractor with some very specific requirements, and they wanted them to be able to respond quickly. Flowing down clauses. The rule states that you are required to flow down all the requirements to your suppliers and that you're responsible for the compliance of those suppliers. So your action here is you haven't done this already, send letters of attestation to all suppliers that you may need to flow down to in order to ascertain their willingness to implement and their intended timelines for compliance. And this will give you enough time when you get that information back to secure alternate suppliers if necessary. We just got a question from Jeff, so I'm going to actually answer it right now since we just talked about ESPs. The question is, can MSPs be scoped out of the CUI environment by ensuring that CUI, log data, et cetera, is on the company assets and not the MSP assets per the definition of MSP, of ESP rather. And it's possible for you to be able to do that. Um, there might be implications for your company, and it might be harder to implement some of the controls, or you might have to do some of those things in-house. It's really going to depend on the case by case basis of what you're able to do. And Marianne asks if documents are scrubbed and CUI is not being passed down to sub tiers, is there still a flow down requirement? That's a really good question. So what we've been seeing is that that the DFAR 7012 clause has been appearing in like almost all of the prime contracts, whether or not the contract is actually going to deliver CUI, because the intent is that the organization is prepared to receive CUI if the clause is in the contract. So this, I would say, is more of a legal question that I am probably not the best person to answer properly. Jim Gopal, who is in the CMMC Industry Standards Council with me, is an attorney, and I'm going to take your question to him and get a good answer on that. We'll make sure we get that answer in a follow-up email, Marianne. And then there's controls you cannot fail. During a CMMC assessment, it's possible that you will fail the full implementation of some controls. In fact, oops, I went way past that. Um, okay, never mind. I was good. Um, in fact, DoD does indicate that POAMs are allowed. Now, people get confused when they say POAMs are allowed. They think they can present themselves for an assessment with items on the POAM. What that actually means is that if you fail certain controls during the assessment, thinking that you are all good, that you have no items on your POAM and that you should pass, but assessor finds some things they will place that on the POAM and you'll have 180 days to remediate and not fail the assessment and still be able to be issued your final certification attestation. But there are some controls you can't fail or you fail your entire assessment. So let's think about that real fast. If you have to attain at least a minimum score of 88 in order for you to pass the CMMC assessment. Um, None of the items on the POAM can have a point value greater than 1, except for CUI encryption, which can be included on the POAM if it's not a value of 1 or 3. None of the following security requirements can be included on the POAM. So those ones that are listed, those 5 controls right there, you cannot fail those. And it's probably a good idea to take a screenshot of this if you don't have access to this information already. None of these controls can be failed or the entire assessment will fail. There is still some confusion though about satisfactory implementation of the controls. So I want to give you guys this hint. We use this a lot when we're looking at the controls. They're written in a way so that they can apply to many different companies, many different organizations, many different business processes, and many different kinds of systems, not just Windows systems. And sometimes that can get confusing because of the language in there. So this is actually what we do to kind of get better clarity. We look at the Rev 3 draft of 800-171 because that is not going to be part of the CMMC rule. The CMMC rule will go forward with a Rev 2 requirement, but we know that there will be a time in the near future where the Rev 3 requirement will be part of CMMC. And it's a really, that document is actually written, I feel, a little better than Rev 2, and it can provide some additional clarity on what's really being asked. So compare the language in Rev 2, Rev 3 final public draft, and the CMMC assessment guide so that you can get a better understanding of, did I do this right? Also consider getting someone trained in your own organization as a CCP or engaging a CCP for guidance. I absolutely loved my CCP course and just consumed all the information. There is so much there that has helped us as an organization to assure that we are doing the right thing for our clients. And I recognize that not everyone will get as excited about CCP as me, but thank God that people like me exist. Also important, DoD is going to implement CMMC in phases. There will be 4 phases to roll out the program. It allows them to roll it out over time. DoD program managers will be the ones responsible for identifying which new contracts are going to include that CMMC requirement, but DoD has ultimate discretion in how this is going to get rolled out. What does it look like? My friend Regan Edens from the CMMC Industry Standards Council actually put together this slide, and I absolutely love it because he's sort of like a CMMC Rain Man, and his brain, I don't know how he can contain all the information that he's got about all of the different rules and like 32 CFR. I mean, sometimes he rolls off all of these clauses and rules, and I'm like, holy cow, man, I don't know how you remember all that off the top of your head. But he put this together for us, and I think it's really great to illustrate what the phases look like. So we're right here um, in 2024. So here, as we're in going to be approaching phase 0 in June through December, you want to make sure that you have your self-assessment completed, and consider when it is that you're going to be presenting yourself for your CMMC assessment. And in phase 1, which will start about 60 days after the rule is passed, so that puts us into the January timeframe of 2025. The self-assessment for everyone at level 1 and level 2, where they decide to roll this out into contracts, is going to be a requirement. So first, your self-assessment requirement at 110 or pass-fail for level 1 needs to be in the SPRS portal. In phase 2, that's when they're going to start to require certification in contracts. So we have a little bit of time there, and they're doing that on purpose so that people can get their certifications. So when they start to issue these new contracts in about the June, July timeframe of next year, that there are enough contractors that have attained that certification so that they can issue those contracts. And then phase three will be in 2026, where they're going to be rolling out um, the certification assessment requirement as well as level three for all solicitations that the DoD program manager deems necessary for the contract itself. And in phase four, um, that's going to be like a fully rolled out program. Other implications of the program for us to think about. Suppliers are not going to bid on renewal contracts and they will end up falling out of the supply chain. That does mean more opportunity for those who remain or new contractors that want to enter. Also, MSPs and MSSPs doing this work will be the first federally regulated providers. That's going to be historical in nature for our country and it's going to set precedents. So don't think that's going to stop here. If you happen to be on the call and you are a service provider and decide that this is not for you, CMMC is not for you, understand this is setting precedents for the federal government to regulate our entire industry. And clearly, some MMSPs and MSPs will no longer be suitable in order to assist. Jeff asks that he says the projected dates have been changing quite a bit. What's your confidence level that the schedule you presented is going to be accurate? The schedule that I presented is actually directly from the rule. This is the first time that they have put that kind of information in the rule, and I have high confidence that they are going to be meeting those deadlines. So what do you do now? If I was you, I would have a clear strategy to attain a 110 score by the end of the year. Vet all of your vendors now. It doesn't matter if you are an MSP or an MSSP or if you are a contractor, vet everybody. MSPs and MSSPs oftentimes use other security tools in order to help to meet the controls, and you need to be talking to them now to assure that they're going to be suitable because you might need to make some changes, and we know that those kinds of transitions are hard and expensive. They're not easy. I also recommend that you implement a quarterly assessment of the controls to assure that your SSP is updated and it makes you take a hard look at the implementation of those controls. Like I mentioned earlier, that's what we do with our clients by having the cyclical security assessment. So we take a kind of a microscopic view on one subset of controls over time. And by doing that, we also update the SSP and then it's always fresh because what you don't want to do is think of this as like a finish line, like, oh, we did all this work, I'm done. And then that time between when you stop doing your compliance cadence actions and the time you present yourself for assessment, you're going to have a really heavy workload in presenting yourself for assessment. So think of it like get your compliance actions and a cadence in place now so that these things are continuously updated and monitored. And then think of that time right before you present yourself for assessment as a quick sprint to double check everything and make sure that it's ready. Um, Also, like I mentioned, you want to make sure that you have the mechanism in place to meet quarterly at least to assure the compliance actions cadence are being completed and that they're documented. And that's going to include reviewing technical controls. So the security configuration settings, any security tools that you're using to meet the controls. That also means reviewing administrative controls, your policies, your plans, your procedures, your physical controls, and any other associated documentation with how you're meeting that. By having yourself on a cadence, and you make sure that those things are updated properly over time. I'm also going to recommend if you want to get armed with some more information about CMMC. These three conferences, we're actually going to be attending them, but they are going to be packed full of information. There's KuiCon, that is the brainchild of assessors Fernando Machado and Matt Titcomb, who are both really good friends of mine. And this will be the second year for that. So highly recommend that you attend those conference. There's a CIC, which is the CMMC Implementation Conference in San Diego, and that's the brainchild of Mark Berman and Future Feed, also a really good friend. Both of those are going to be packed full. And then I'm going to be speaking to MSPs about and MSSPs about this situation at an industry event in April, helping them to understand what's required and the changes they have to make ASAP. Joe asks, given the requirement to ultimately submit a score of 110, do you think that GCC high is the only practical way to meet all the controls for CMMC and DFARS? No, I don't think it's the only practical way. Some organizations that we work with, it would be very expensive and really debilitate their business to put everything that is CUI into a GCC or GCC high environment. Also, to note that GCC is sometimes okay, the government cloud, and sometimes they need the high cloud depending on the type of CUI that is in your contract and that you are a custodian of. Um, I've been told by Fernando, he says, yeah, uh, Microsoft 365 is kind of like the easy button, and one of the gentlemen who's an MSP who's in our MSP coaching program for CMMC is an expert in all things Microsoft 365. And after looking at his implementations, I can understand why it could be seen as an easy button. However, due to the data flow and the nature of the kind of data that you're working with, sometimes that's just not possible. And it is actually completely achievable to meet a 110 score, having a hybrid environment or having an entirely on-prem infrastructure. Joe asks if we will provide this step to attendees. Absolutely. That will also be provided to everyone in the follow-up email. Any other burning questions? All right. So my action item for you all is to get Marianne's question answered about flow down to sub tiers and a little bit more clarity on what that looks like to give you some guidance. If between the time that I send the email, if you get off the call and you're like, I actually did have some questions, please shoot me an email because I want to make sure that I get everyone's questions answered and give you the information you need in order to be successful in this. And then we'll send that follow-up email. We'll include the slide deck so that you have that as well as any answers to questions that anybody submits. So I promise to make this brief, and that is our brief for the CMMC proposed rule. Again, I went through this incredibly fast and very high level. There's implications into a lot of these things, and there's also much more information in the rule than we talked about today. Much of that information, everyone on the call already knows because we're not going to go over what CMMC is again, because I think everyone who's here knows what CMMC is. That's why you're here. So um, it was a pleasure to be able to share this information with you and looking forward to getting all this out to you in a follow-up. Thank you for coming today.